April 12, 1945. Dawn broke over Baguio, Philippines, not with the golden warmth of hope, but under a sky the color of ash. The light was thin, almost reluctant, as it fell on the muddy yard of a makeshift detention compound. There, 24 Japanese women knelt in silence, heads bowed, hands pressed together in quiet, desperate prayer. They were not praying for rescue. They were praying for death. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura kept her spine straight despite the ache in her knees. Her uniform, once crisp, now hung in tatters around her thin frame. She could hear the steady breathing of the women beside her, some ragged, some almost still. One, she knew, had stopped breathing entirely during the night. No one had dared move the body. To die in prayer was still better than what they feared awaited them. Yoshiko's fingers trembled slightly as she pressed them together. She hoped the others wouldn't notice. Weakness was not allowed. She was an officer of the Imperial Japanese Army. She had to lead them into death with dignity. Inside, though, her heart thudded like a frightened bird. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the calm she'd once felt during parade drills in Kyoto, before the war had taken everything. Her home, her certainty, her humanity. She could hear them now, boots in the distance, crunching slowly through the gravel, heavy, deliberate, American boots. She thought of the training films, the propaganda reels, American soldiers laughing as they torched villages, Americans bayoneting prisoners while smoking cigarettes. The voice of her commanding officer echoed from memory. The enemy shows no mercy. Better to die with honor. Beside her, Sergeant Michiko Tanaka murmured a prayer under her breath. Michiko, the surgeon's nurse who once soothed dying soldiers with songs. Her voice cracked with thirst, but she sang anyway. A hymn from childhood, about cherry blossoms falling in spring. Private Yuki Harada, the youngest among them, only 19, clutched a faded cloth doll she had sewn from medical bandages. Her lips moved silently. She wasn't praying, she was counting, waiting for the sound of gunfire. She wanted to be ready for the moment the world ended. The boots stopped. No one dared raise their heads. The gate creaked open. Not a word was spoken. For a long moment there was only the sound of breathing and the low buzz of mourning insects. Then something else, a different sound. Not the clatter of rifles, not the rasp of orders. A clink, a thud, a soft scraping. Crates. Yoshiko opened her eyes just enough to see shapes moving. American soldiers, yes, but not with weapons drawn. They were carrying boxes. She could smell something foreign on the air. Warm, yeasty, sweet, something impossibly familiar. Bread? She forced herself to look up. Captain William Morrison stood in the center of the yard, sunlight hitting the edge of his helmet. He looked down at them not with the cold calculation she expected, but with something stranger. Weariness, sadness, maybe even, no, it couldn't be, pity. He gave a nod. Behind him, soldiers placed crates on the ground and stepped back. The top crate was open. Inside, cans of meat, fruit cocktail, chocolate bars, coffee tins. The smells overwhelmed her senses. Her stomach, dormant for days, clenched suddenly with pain. Yoshiko stared at the food, then back at the Americans. She couldn't speak. None of them could. The truth was too impossible. It made no sense. From behind Morrison stepped a young soldier, Japanese-American, she realized with a jolt. He bowed slightly and spoke in careful, halting Japanese. "You are not being executed," he said. "This is breakfast." The words struck like thunder. Private Yuki let out a tiny sob. Michiko's hands went slack. One of the older women collapsed completely, not from injury, but from the unbearable release of terror. Yoshiko didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was still expecting death. Her mind could not process kindness. Captain Morrison stepped forward. He picked up a can, opened it, and took a bite himself. He looked at her, directly into her eyes. "Tell them it's real," he said to the interpreter. "Tell them they're not going to die today." In that moment, everything cracked. Everything they had believed. The enemy's cruelty, the certainty of execution, the pride in dying for the emperor. It all crumbled under the weight of a can of corned beef and the smell of hot coffee. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything had. This story is not in textbooks, it is not found in films or war memorials, but it happened. And what happened next, in the days and weeks that followed, would shake the foundations of everything these women thought they knew about war, about their enemies, and most of all about themselves. Stay with me, because what took place in that muddy compound was not just survival, it was revelation, and in the heart of war, it became a lesson in what it means to be human. 6 months earlier, in October of 1944, the world these women knew had already begun to collapse. The air in the Philippines was thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder as American forces surged back across the islands, fulfilling the promise General Douglas MacArthur had made 2 years earlier. His return was not simply a military maneuver, it was a sweeping tide that signaled the end of Japanese control. News of his landing spread through the ranks with the weight of inevitability, a sign that the empire's reach was shrinking faster than anyone wanted to admit. And Luzon alone, nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers were scattered across the mountains, valleys, and city ruins. Among them were the roughly 200 women serving the Imperial Army in roles that ranged from communications officers to nurses and clerks. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura had been assigned to Baguio as a communications officer, managing coded transmissions and coordinating with field units in the region. Her orders were clear, her duty absolute. She carried herself with the stern dignity expected of an educated officer, her posture straight, her voice firm. She believed in discipline the way others believed in prayer. But even for Yoshiko, the creeping sense of dread was impossible to ignore. The army's supply lines were failing, reinforcements were not coming, and the once victorious imperial forces were giving ground peace by bloody peace. Still, surrender was unthinkable. The Senjin-kun, the Imperial Army's field service code, demanded death before dishonor. Soldiers kept grenades on their belts not just for battle, but for themselves, should capture become unavoidable. Officers like Yoshiko had been taught the same thing from the beginning. Prisoners of war brought shame to the empire, shame to their families, shame to themselves. Sergeant Michiko Tanaka, who had spent years working in military hospitals in Manchuria, before being stationed in the Philippines, saw the consequences of this code in the bodies that came through her care. Young men who had blown themselves apart rather than fall into enemy hands. Officers who used their pistols, not just on wounded Americans, but on wounded Japanese who begged to be left behind. She had learned to swallow grief the way one swallowed bitter medicine, quickly, without looking back. Private Yuki Harada, 19, had joined the military as a clerk, not a fighter. She was barely more than a girl, still shy, still soft-spoken, but even she had absorbed the same dark truths repeated endlessly in radio broadcasts, news bulletins, and training halls. Americans were monsters, they were told. Americans tortured, Americans massacred, Americans showed mercy to no one, least of all women. The message had been hammered into them with precision. It was not enough to fear death, they had to fear capture more. Those beliefs hardened during the final days of Japan's control over the region. Propaganda reached a fevered pitch. Yoshiko remembered the film reel they had been shown just weeks before the American advance. The flickering black and white frame showing staged scenes of Americans brutalizing prisoners. Men beaten senseless, women dragged away screaming, villages burning. The narrator's voice rang sharp and cold. The enemy has no soul, fight to your last breath. When Baguio began to fall in March 1945, the collapse was swift and chaotic. Ordered withdrawals quickly turned into frantic retreats. Units splintered, supplies vanished, wounded soldiers were left behind without ceremony. In the confusion, the group of women attached to the field hospital, nurses, clerks, and communications staff, found themselves cut off from the main Japanese force. Their commanding officer, panicked and desperate, gave an order that still haunted Yoshiko: scatter, hide, survive if you can. The Americans will take no prisoners. It was not survival they expected, it was simply a postponement of the inevitable. For 3 weeks, the women moved through abandoned streets and into the surrounding mountains, avoiding American patrols by mere chance. They slept in bombed-out homes, in drainage ditches, in caves whose dampness gnawed into their bones. Their rations dwindled to almost nothing. Michiko did her best to treat fevers with scraps of herbs and boiled rainwater, but medicine was gone, food was gone, hope was gone long before their strength was. On March 28th, in the ruins of a collapsed warehouse, Michiko wrote her final entry in the small diary she carried hidden in her uniform: "We have no food, no medicine." Fumiko's fever rises. Yuki cries in her sleep. Every night I hear the Americans in the trees. Every night I think, tomorrow they will find us. Tomorrow it ends. 2 days later, Fumiko collapsed completely, her breathing shallow and quick. Yuki tried to lift her, but her arms shook too violently. Yoshiko ordered them to keep moving anyway, but even she could hear the futility in her own voice. They were no longer soldiers. They were shadows, stumbling through a world that no longer had a place for them. Their capture, when it finally came, was almost gentle. There was no firefight, no shouting, no violence. A patrol found them huddled in a corner of the warehouse, too weak to stand. When the soldiers approached, the women closed their eyes and bowed their heads, expecting a bullet or a bayonet. Instead, the young Japanese-American soldiers stepped forward and spoke softly in their own language. But they didn't understand. They couldn't. Mercy did not exist in the world they had been taught to believe in. And so, when they were escorted to the detention compound, when they were given water and a small bowl of rice porridge, they refused it. They believed it was poison. Their fear was not irrational. It was cultivated, nurtured, and enforced through years of propaganda and unquestioned loyalty to an empire that had already abandoned them. They were waiting for death because they had never been allowed to imagine anything else. It was April 2nd, 1945, when the women were finally discovered. Morning fog still clung to the ruined landscape like a shroud as an American patrol moved quietly through the outskirts of Baguio. The war was everywhere, charred buildings, shattered windows, the sour scent of decay. But so was the silence, that eerie, unsettling quiet that comes only after too much death. Private First Class Robert Chen walked at the center of the formation, his M1 slung across his shoulder. As a Nisei soldier, second-generation Japanese-American, he had long since grown used to the strange weight of serving in a war against the country of his ancestors. His face matched those of the enemy, but his loyalties were never in question. He had lost cousins in Pearl Harbor. He had volunteered to fight to prove that loyalty to anyone who doubted. It was Chen who first noticed the broken warehouse. The patrol approached carefully, weapons ready. The structure had been bombed, its roof half collapsed, one wall nearly gone. Inside, the light filtered through in strips, casting uneven shadows across the dirt-streaked floor. Chen stepped through the jagged doorway, eyes adjusting, then he froze. In the far corner, huddled together, were bodies. No, women. They didn't scream, they didn't run, they didn't even move. 24 of them, clustered like frightened deer, eyes shut tight, hands clenched in their laps. Some wore the remnants of military uniforms, though they were now little more than rags. Others were barefoot, skin streaked with mud and blood, hair tangled and matted. Several looked barely alive. Chen took a step forward, then another. One of the women stirred. Her lips moved soundlessly. Then another woman, slightly older, looked up, her eyes dull, as if she were looking through him rather than at him. Hands up, the American sergeant barked behind Chen, but there was no need. The women made no motion. They simply bowed their heads lower, like prisoners already facing the executioner. "I think they're nurses," Chen said softly. "Japanese military." "You sure?" the sergeant asked. Chen nodded. "Some of the uniforms, and the way they're kneeling, that's not fear, that's ritual. They think we're going to kill them." The patrol lowered their weapons cautiously, and within minutes, the women were gently coaxed out from the corner. They did not resist. They could barely walk. When the Americans handed them canteens, most of the women hesitated before drinking. One, the youngest, refused entirely until Chen demonstrated by taking a sip from his own. He remembered her face, wide-eyed, barely out of girlhood. She held the water bottle like it might bite her. Her name, he would learn later, was Yuki Harada. They loaded the women onto a truck, slowly, carefully, and transported them to a temporary holding compound just outside the city. It was not a proper POW camp. It was a makeshift enclosure surrounded by wire, with a few army tents, a field latrine, and access to a freshwater stream. The war was still too active for formal facilities. The orders given to the American soldiers were clear: secure the area, prevent escape, and provide the minimum humanitarian standards outlined in the Geneva Convention. Food rations were issued twice daily: rice porridge, sometimes dried fish. But there were no medics assigned, no translators besides Chen, and no training in how to handle female prisoners. And the prisoners, for their part, refused to eat. For the first few days, the women barely touched their food. Some simply stared at it, Others buried their bowls in the dirt when the guards weren't looking. It wasn't defiance, it was something else. "They think we're fattening them up," Chen explained to the officers, "like animals before slaughter." Sergeant Michiko Tanaka remained the most lucid, though she was exhausted and battling an early fever. She sat apart from the others, scribbling fragments into a diary she had somehow managed to keep hidden even through capture. One entry, dated April 3rd, read, "The Americans bring rice and water, but we do not eat. We know what comes next." Fumiko Sato, the youngest nurse, had slipped into delirium, whispering in half-conscious Japanese about home, about her mother, about a cherry tree that no longer bloomed. She burned with fever, and without medicine, there was nothing Michiko could do. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura tried to keep some semblance of structure. She called them to attention each morning, made them recite the emperor's decree, even as they sat in mud with sunken cheeks and trembling limbs. Her voice cracked more each day. They weren't soldiers anymore, they were ghosts in waiting. Meanwhile, the American guards were confused. Some were young farm boys from the Midwest who had never seen an Asian woman in their lives. Others were battle-hardened, angry, grieving for lost friends. They watched the women with suspicion, sometimes disgust, sometimes pity. But no one quite knew how to bridge the gap between duty and decency. Corporal James Rodriguez wrote a letter to his sister during that time. "It's the damnedest thing," he wrote. "We were told they were demons, that they'd fight to the last breath. But these women, they just sit there, quiet as church mice, like they've already died." The air in the compound was heavy with the weight of unspoken things. No one yelled, no one cried. There was only the rustling of wind through barbed wire, the clink of tin bowls, and the occasional cough from Fumiko's corner of the tent. Captain Morrison had not yet visited the compound. But when he did, everything changed. Captain William Morrison had seen too much war to believe in neat resolutions. He had landed at Leyte Gulf the previous October and fought his way north through jungle heat, mud, and blood. He had buried men he'd trained with, watched boys scream for their mothers as they bled out in foxholes, and tried to keep some semblance of himself intact while carrying out orders that made no room for sentiment. He had learned, as so many did, to compartmentalize. The enemy was the enemy. That made things simple. And then he stepped into the compound. It was supposed to be a routine inspection. Walk the perimeter, check on supplies, ensure the guards were following the manual. But what Morrison saw that morning was not something he could categorize. 24 Japanese women, hunched over in the mud, silent and unmoving. Their uniforms hung off skeletal frames, their hair was matted, their hands raw. The youngest, barely more than a girl, stared at the ground with such emptiness it made Morrison's breath catch. And there, in the corner, one of them coughed, wet and sharp. Fever, infection, no treatment. He turned to Private Chen. "They're not eating?" Chen shook his head. "They think we're preparing them for torture, or execution." Morrison looked around. "How long have they been like this?" "Over a week. Since capture. Some haven't said a word since we brought them in." The captain said nothing for a long moment. He studied their faces. This wasn't resistance, it wasn't defiance, it was something deeper, resignation. He had seen it before, in the eyes of wounded soldiers who'd stopped fighting to live. He took a slow breath and turned to his supply sergeant. "Get me breakfast," he said. The sergeant frowned. "Sir, not rations, not porridge, get real breakfast, everything you can get your hands on." Within the hour, trucks rolled into the compound carrying crates from the division's supply depot. Soldiers offloaded boxes of canned meats, fresh bread, fruit cocktail, tins of coffee, chocolate bars. Things most frontline units hadn't seen in weeks. The smell hit first: warm bread, sweet fruit, real coffee. The Japanese women didn't move at first. They barely looked up. One of them, Yuki, sat cross-legged beside a sick friend, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She blinked at the sound of crates thudding against the ground. She smelled chocolate but didn't trust it. Corporal Rodriguez stood nearby and later wrote to his sister about what happened next. They opened the crates right there in the middle of the yard, set everything out in the open, like a picnic. I was watching this girl, maybe 20 years old, but she looked 15 with how thin she was. She didn't blink, just stared like it was a hallucination. Then one of them cried, just a little, then another. Then they all started crying. And I swear to God, I've never seen anything like it. Not in the war, not anywhere. Michiko was the first to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced herself upright. She walked slowly toward the crates and picked up a can of corned beef. She turned it over in her hands, unsure whether to believe what she was seeing. She looked at Captain Morrison, then at the can. She said something softly in Japanese. "She's asking if it's poisoned," Chen translated. Morrison didn't flinch. He took the can from her, opened it with his knife, scooped out a chunk, and ate it. Then he handed the can back. "Tell her it's real," he said. "Tell her they're not going to die today." That moment cracked something open. The women moved slowly, cautiously. No one rushed, no one grabbed. They approached like animals, unsure if the hand reaching toward them held food or a blade. Some took only a small portion and brought it back to others who couldn't stand. Others sat down right there and ate in silence. Yuki picked up a chocolate bar and held it in both hands, like it might shatter if she squeezed too hard. She didn't eat it. Not at first. She stared at it for nearly a full minute before unwrapping one corner and taking the tiniest bite. It was sweet, unbelievably sweet. The kind of sweetness that didn't exist in a world at war. She cried. Fumiko, too sick to move, was fed by Michiko, who now had tears in her own eyes. Yoshiko, ever the officer, tried to maintain composure. But when a soldier handed her a cup of coffee, she accepted it with both hands and nodded deeply. She didn't drink right away. She simply held it, inhaled the steam, and let the warmth remind her that she was still alive. Over the next few hours, the compound transformed, not completely, not into peace, not into trust, but into something less cold, less dead. Morrison requisitioned medical supplies. An army medic arrived and examined Fumiko, starting her on sulfa drugs. Canvas cots replaced the damp ground. A water purification unit was installed. Blankets were issued. The change in the women was slow but visible. They began to speak again. Not much, but enough. They ate. They moved. They looked at the guards as people, not executioners. For Morrison, it was just one morning in a long, brutal campaign, but he would remember it for the rest of his life. He wrote in his field journal that evening, "Today, I gave food to the enemy. I expected suspicion. I saw gratitude. Maybe we fight to destroy their army, but maybe we win when we reach their humanity." The days that followed passed slowly, like thaw after a long and bitter winter. For the first time since their capture, the Japanese women began to move with purpose. They were no longer waiting for death. They were not yet living, but they had begun, quietly, to return to themselves. Fumiko's fever broke on the third morning after the breakfast. The sulfa drugs had worked. She was still weak, still coughing, but her eyes regained some clarity. When Michiko brought her warm broth that day, Fumiko reached for the bowl with trembling hands and whispered a word no one had heard from her in days, "Arigato." The shift was subtle, but real. Meals were eaten, not discarded. The women bathed in the stream, under guard supervision, washing away layers of dirt, sweat, and fear. Some spoke softly to one another now, their voices cautious, like the sound of birds after a storm. Private Yuki Harada became a quiet favorite among the guards. Not because she smiled, she rarely did, but because she watched everything. She was curious. When one of the American soldiers, Corporal Rodriguez, fumbled with a cup, she giggled quietly. It was the first laughter anyone had heard from the prisoners. Rodriguez, startled, looked up and smiled. "You understand English?" Yuki hesitated, then pointed at his canteen. "Water," she said carefully. He nodded, then tapped his own chest. "James." She tilted her head, then pointed to herself. "Yuki." That was how it began. Not with speeches, with names. Over the next several days, the women began to exchange more than just words. One morning, Yuki handed Rodriguez a folded paper. On it, she had written 3 English words in careful slanted print: sky, rain, peace. He took a pencil and added the Japanese equivalents beside them. When he handed it back, she smiled, and he swore it warmed the entire compound. Captain Morrison continued to visit daily, though he said little. He oversaw medical updates, confirmed supply deliveries, and often walked the perimeter quietly, hands behind his back, observing. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura remained reserved. She still stood straight when addressed, still nodded formally, but even she was changing. She helped organize the sleeping arrangements, consulted with the guards about distributing blankets more fairly, and once corrected a guard who was about to give Fumiko spoiled rice. When Morrison noticed, he pulled Chen aside. Ask her if she'd be willing to help maintain order in the compound. Chen relayed the message. Yoshiko paused, surprised, then answered evenly, "I will not betray my people." Chen nodded. "Tell him she says no." But the next morning, Yoshiko did it anyway. Quietly, unofficially. She ensured sick women were cared for, water was boiled, chores were done, not for the Americans, for her people, her unit, her dignity. Sergeant Michiko Tanaka, too, began to find her footing again. She consulted with the American medic about basic treatments and began volunteering to assist. The medic, a young man from Nebraska named Thompson, was shocked at her knowledge. "She knows more about field medicine than half the guys we trained," he told Morrison. "She was a nurse in Manchuria," Morrison replied. "She's seen everything." Michiko never spoke of what she had seen, not in detail. But one afternoon, while helping Thompson change a bandage on Fumiko, she glanced at him and said, "Pain makes people cruel, or kind. Sometimes both." He didn't know how to respond. Each night the compound felt a little less like a prison. One evening, a tropical downpour swept through the mountains. The guards scrambled to cover supplies, and the women rushed for shelter. In the confusion, Yuki found herself huddled beneath a tarp with 3 American soldiers, Rodriguez among them. No one spoke for a while, just listened to the rain drum against the canvas. Then someone passed around a pack of Lucky Strikes. Yuki watched them light up, the glowing tips flickering like fireflies. She reached for one. Rodriguez lit it for her. She coughed on the first drag, then smiled faintly. "Same rain," she said, slowly pointing upward. Rodriguez looked up, then at her. "Same sky." They sat like that for nearly 20 minutes, sharing smoke and silence. It didn't mean the war was over, it didn't erase what had been done. But for those 20 minutes, they weren't enemies. Just people under the same storm. By the end of April, the compound had transformed. It still had guards, still had boundaries, still bore the marks of war. But within its fences, a fragile kind of peace had taken root. Not trust, not forgiveness, but recognition. Recognition that even behind enemy uniforms were faces. That even after propaganda, silence, and suffering, there was room for humanity. Captain Morrison wrote in his journal, "They don't salute anymore. They bow." And I bow back. Maybe we're not soldiers here. Not entirely. Maybe we're just people trying to get through the same nightmare. The order came on May 6th. Captain Morrison received the telegram just after dawn. The Japanese women were to be transferred to a permanent POW facility in Manila. The compound would be dismantled, the guards reassigned, supplies reallocated. The war in northern Luzon was shifting, and the army needed to consolidate its resources. It was not a surprise. The temporary site had always been a stopgap. But when Morrison read the message, he felt something he hadn't expected: reluctance. He looked around the compound, at the canvas tents, the makeshift washing line someone had rigged from parachute cord, the faces that no longer averted their eyes. He thought of Fumiko, now able to walk short distances. He thought of Michiko, who now helped the medic like she had always belonged there. He thought of Yoshiko, still proud, still quiet, but no longer waiting to die. And Yuki, who had started to laugh again. That afternoon, Morrison gathered the women and stood before them with Chen at his side. He kept his hands behind his back, his expression steady. The women formed a half circle, standing, some sitting on cots. There was no formal address, no trumpet call. Just words. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will be taken to Manila. There is a larger camp there. You'll have real medical care, beds, clean water, safety," Chen translated. The women listened in silence. After a moment, Michiko raised her hand. "She wants to know," Chen said, turning to Morrison. "If you'll be there." Morrison shook his head. "No, my unit is moving north. I won't be joining you." There was a pause. Then Michiko bowed, a full, deep bow from the waist. One by one, the other women followed. Yoshiko was last, her movements slow but deliberate. She stepped forward and extended her hand. Morrison hesitated, then took it. "You showed us," Yoshiko said in careful English, "that everything we were told was wrong." He didn't answer at first. Then he nodded, slowly. "Maybe that's the real victory," he said. "Learning the enemy is just people." That night, the women prepared their belongings in silence. They had little to pack. Some letters, fragments of paper, small tokens of the past. Yuki folded the paper Rodriguez had given her with the English and Japanese words and slipped it into her shirt. She didn't cry, but her hands shook slightly. Rodriguez stood watch that night. He walked the perimeter one last time, then stopped near the tent where Yuki slept. He didn't say anything, just looked at the stars for a while. The next morning the trucks arrived. There was no ceremony, no music, just the shuffling of boots, the rumble of engines, and the quiet farewells exchanged in halting phrases and soft gestures. Yuki approached Rodriguez and placed something in his hand, a folded piece of paper. Inside, written in Japanese and English, same sky. No more war. He tucked it into his pocket and nodded. Michiko gave Morrison a worn armband with the red cross faded nearly to white. She said nothing, but he understood. Yoshiko was last to board. She turned back at the gate, scanned the compound one final time, then met Morrison's gaze. She bowed again, not out of submission, but out of something else, something older, deeper, respect. Morrison returned the bow, stiffly, awkwardly. But honestly, you deserve to be treated like human beings, he said. I'm glad we could do that much. The women rode in silence as the trucks rumbled south. The compound faded behind them, swallowed by dust and distance. It had been only a few weeks, a blink in the vastness of war. But in that place, something extraordinary had happened. Enemies had seen each other, not as soldiers, not as victors or defeated, but as people. The POW camp in Manila was larger, cleaner, and better organized. There were real beds, metal frames with thin mattresses, curtained infirmary rooms, and a daily schedule that resembled normal life more than the holding compound in Baguio ever could. Yet somehow it felt colder. The intimacy that had formed in the mud and quiet desperation of the mountains was gone. Here, there were hundreds of prisoners, Japanese men and women, military and civilian, filed into barracks, monitored by new guards who didn't know their names or their stories. The camp ran like a machine, efficient but impersonal. For the 24 women from Baguio, the transition was unsettling. Fumiko, though physically improved, seemed emotionally adrift. She slept little, speaking in fragmented thoughts. At night she had dreams, dark, twisted recreations of their capture. In these nightmares the Americans were monsters, as the propaganda had promised. They struck without reason. They smiled while inflicting pain. She would wake up in a sweat, confused, disoriented, staring into the faces of American nurses who had just bathed her, fed her, saved her life. One afternoon she asked Michiko, which one was real, the dreams or the mornings with coffee? Michiko couldn't answer. The camp psychologist, Captain Eleanor Hayes, an American woman with sharp eyes and a softer voice, interviewed many of the female POWs. In her reports she wrote, "Some of these women are experiencing severe psychological dissonance. Their beliefs have been dismantled by their lived experience. They were taught that Americans were beasts, but instead of brutality, they received care. That contradiction has left them floating." Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura was perhaps the most visibly affected. For days after arriving at Manila, she did not speak unless spoken to. She followed protocol, reported when called, and offered no resistance, but her silence was thick with something unspoken. Her bearing remained upright, her eyes firm, but her soul was unraveling. She had built her identity as an officer of the Imperial Army. Her sense of worth came from structure, order, and obedience, but the army had abandoned her. Her commanders had left her to rot. Her enemies had kept her alive. She began spending hours in the camp's small library, flipping through any book written in Japanese, old texts on poetry, philosophy, even English dictionaries with scribbled marginal notes. She said little to the others, but sometimes she paused and stared at a page for a long time, as if waiting for the words to make something make sense. Michiko tried to talk to her one evening. "You haven't been sleeping," she said gently. Yoshiko responded after a moment. "I don't know who I am if I'm not an officer." Michiko nodded. "You're still you. You're still alive. That has to mean something." "I don't know if it does," Yoshiko said. "I saluted a system that lied to me. I bowed to a man who left us to die, and I shook hands with the enemy who fed us." "It wasn't the enemy," Michiko said softly. "It was a man, just a man." Yuki, by contrast, adapted more easily. At 20, she had been less deeply conditioned than her seniors. She found the routine of the camp, scheduled meals, hygiene, structured chores, comforting, and she gravitated toward the American nurses and staff, especially those who spoke a little Japanese. Within a month, she was helping translate instructions for other female prisoners, even teaching basic Japanese to American staff members curious about the language. When asked where she had learned so much English, she smiled and said, "From the enemy." They gave me chocolate and words. One of the nurses, Sergeant Denise Holloway, became particularly fond of Yuki. They would sit together during off hours, exchanging vocabulary. Yuki would point to objects, sky, tree, hope, and Denise would repeat the words in English and write them down for her. Sometimes Yuki would pause and ask in a quiet voice, "Is it strange to be kind to people who were once your enemy?" Denise answered, "Not strange, just rare." August came. The heat pressed down like a wet cloth. Rumors swept through the camp. Germany had surrendered in May. The Pacific Theater was collapsing. Japan was on its last legs. Then, on August 15th, the news came. Emperor Hirohito's voice broadcast by radio. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The reaction in the camp was a mixture of disbelief, relief, and silence. Some of the men shouted. Others wept. Some simply sat on their bunks, staring into the distance. Yoshiko listened to the transmission in a language that had once stirred pride. Now it stirred nothing. She left the room quietly, walked to the edge of the camp fence, and stared at the Philippine sky. A guard watched her for a moment, then looked away. Michiko cried that evening, but she wasn't sure why. The war was over, but the grief remained, for the years lost, for the ideals shattered, for the friends who hadn't made it. Fumiko wrote a single sentence in her notebook, "I lived." That night, Yuki dreamed of a card game under a tarp in the rain. She heard the sound of laughter, American laughter. She woke up smiling. Somewhere beyond the wire, planes flew low, heading east. The future had arrived, but no one yet knew what it would ask of them. Repatriation took time. Even after the war officially ended, paperwork lagged, ships were delayed, and infrastructure across Asia lay in ruin. The women remained in the Manila POW camp for several more months. They were no longer prisoners, technically, but not yet civilians. Their identities hung in limbo, former enemies, now fragile survivors in someone else's country. Letters began to arrive slowly, through the Red Cross. Some were hopeful. Others brought news that felt like another kind of bomb. One woman learned her brother had died in Okinawa. Another, that her hometown in Tokyo had been reduced to rubble. Michiko received word that her parents were alive, but her clinic in Hiroshima was gone. Yuki had no word at all. She didn't know if her family had made it. She didn't even know where home was anymore. In November, they were placed aboard a U.S. Navy transport bound for Japan. The sea was cold and choppy, and most of the women spent the voyage below deck, wrapped in donated coats, speaking only in whispers. As they approached the Japanese coastline, some of them cried. Others said nothing. Yoshiko stood at the bow on the final morning, watching the mist give way to the ruined shoreline. From a distance, Japan didn't look like home. It looked like a wound. The ship docked at Uraga Harbor. The air was sharp with salt and smoke. They disembarked in silence. A few officials from the newly forming Japanese government were there to process them. Efficient, expressionless men with clipboards and rubber stamps. There was no welcome committee, no banners, no thanks for their service. Just a short statement, "You may return to your homes," if they still exist. That first night on Japanese soil, Michiko stayed in a dormitory set up for returnees. Her hands shook as she lit a small oil lamp. Her mother had written that the family home in Hiroshima had been spared the direct blast, though many neighbors had not. The streets were gone. The shops vanished. The temples scorched. Still, they waited for her. When she finally reached the village, days later, she stood before the shell of the house and saw her mother waiting on the porch, older, thinner, but alive. They embraced. Neither spoke for a long time. Later that night, as Michiko recounted her experience, her mother listened with closed eyes. When Michiko described the Americans, Captain Morrison, the breakfast, the medicine, her mother opened her eyes again. "You should not talk about that too much," she said. "People will not understand." "But it's true," Michiko said. "I know," her mother replied. "But truth does not always survive wars. Shame does." Still, Michiko could not stay silent. She returned to work as a nurse in a nearby clinic. And sometimes, when the pain of a patient was too great, when fear clouded their faces, she would tell them the story. "An American captain gave me breakfast," she would say. "He gave me medicine when I expected death." Some patients believed her. Others frowned. One old doctor once told her, "Maybe that's how we rebuild, not with walls or soldiers, but with stories like that." Yoshiko's return was harder. Her husband, a former naval officer, had survived, but their reunion was not joyful. He had fought until the final weeks, clinging to the dream of a victorious Japan. When she told him of the American camp, of the respect she had received, of the shame she felt toward the officers who abandoned her, he turned away. "I don't know who you are anymore," he said. "Neither do I," she replied. They lived under the same roof, but for months barely spoke. Until one evening, after a bitter winter rain, she found him standing in front of a small shrine in their home. He was crying, silently. She approached, said nothing, just stood beside him. Eventually they spoke again, not about ideology, but about exhaustion, about grief, and about the strange gift of survival. Yuki struggled too. She had lost everything. Her parents were presumed dead. Her home was flattened. For weeks, she drifted from shelter to shelter, unsure of what future could exist for someone like her. But she was young, and language had always come easily. She found a job assisting an American-sponsored school in Yokohama, helping translate between teachers and students. Soon, she was tutoring Japanese children in English, teaching them not just grammar, but how to say words like peace, friend, rain. When asked where she had learned, she would answer simply, "From the enemy." They became my teachers. She kept the chocolate wrapper Captain Morrison had given her folded in a book of poems. On the back she had written in pencil, "Same sky." For years, none of the women from Baguio spoke publicly. They returned to quiet lives, to homes rebuilt on ash. But memory lingered. Some tried to forget, others refused. Because sometimes, in the dark, they still saw the compound, still smelled the coffee, still heard the clink of crates in the mud. They had survived. But that survival demanded remembering. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, 15 of the 24 women from the Baguio compound gathered again. This time in Tokyo. The meeting was informal, arranged by letters passed quietly through survivors and support groups. They met in a small room above a tea house, sitting on tatami mats, sipping warm barley tea. Outside, the city still bore scars, broken walls, half-rebuilt alleys, children playing in bombed-out lots. But inside, there was something fragile and whole. They hadn't all stayed in touch. Some had chosen silence, others had scattered across regions. But now, face to face again, they looked at one another with a kind of reverence. They had all changed, older, thinner. Some now mothers, some widows, some still waiting to define what peace meant. No one gave a speech. There were no toasts at first, just quiet conversation, laughter in small bursts, eyes that welled with tears unspoken. Yoshiko, still dignified, poured tea for Michiko, who now wore a white nurse's pin on her collar. Fumiko arrived late, wrapped in a scarf despite the spring sun. She sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded over a small notebook. Yuki brought sweet buns from a bakery in Yokohama. She placed them carefully on a plate in the center. "This," she said softly in English, "is breakfast." The women smiled. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, not because the food was rare, but because the moment was. After a while, Yoshiko lifted her teacup. She looked around the room and said simply, "To survival." The others raised theirs. "To the men who fed us," Michiko added. Yuki, almost a whisper, "To second chances." Then Fumiko, her voice dry but clear, said, "To remembering." And the room fell quiet again. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, they took a group photo. It was black and white, slightly overexposed. 15 women, some smiling, some solemn. Behind them, the walls of Tokyo still half-built. In their eyes, history lived, not in monuments or parades, but in quiet defiance of forgetting. That photo would sit in a drawer in Michiko's home for decades. She never showed it to many people. Only once, in 1982, did she take it out for a visitor, historian Thomas Nakamura, who had come to interview survivors for a book he would never quite finish. She showed him the photo, and then her old diary. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting careful. He read an entry dated April 12, 1945. "The Americans brought us food. How do we make sense of enemies who feed us?" Michiko, now in her 70s, sipped her tea and said, "The worst lies make us see others as less than human. But memory reminds us who we really are." When Nakamura asked if she still remembered their names, she nodded and recited each one slowly, carefully, like prayer. Even the ones who didn't come home, she said. Especially them. Captain William Morrison never received medals for what he did in the compound. He didn't expect any. After the war, he returned to Portland, Oregon, resumed teaching history. He married, raised 2 children, and lived a quiet life. When asked once by a student what he remembered most about the war, he paused a long time. April 1945, he finally said, "Philippines. We were supposed to guard a group of enemy prisoners." He looked out the window, his voice softer. "But we brought them breakfast instead. There's no monument to that moment, no plaque, only memory." And a story passed quietly through time, from woman to daughter, from soldier to student. A story not of victory, but of vision, not of generals, but of grace. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of war, the light of human decency can still flicker. Sometimes that flicker is enough. Sometimes it changes everything.